So as Rabbi Doug noted, I went to Israel on a church tour. Up until that point in my life, Israel had just never been part of the picture of my faith. No one had ever mentioned it. And we suddenly got there and realized, wait a second, this place actually matters to us, matters to our faith. And it wasn't only that it matters to us as a piece of our history, it matters to us in that we're sitting here and we're realizing that the Bible is actually still going on. Like it's still continuing, it's still alive, it's still being fulfilled. So that's what drew me. A little bit about Israel Today, where I now work. Israel Today was started between 30 and 40 years ago in the German language first by a Messianic family that made Aliyah from Germany, right around the time that the church in Germany was coming to a point of true repentance for what their nation had done. And there was lacking a source of information from Israel. So they filled that gap. About 16 years ago, they started to realize, there's a lot of English language coverage from Israel, but it's really, really bad. So they launched an English version of the magazine for two purposes: to counter that media bias, and we've all seen examples of it. Last year's Gaza war provided probably the most blatant example in years, not only because the reportage out of Gaza itself was bad, but because once a lot of those foreign reporters actually got out of Gaza, they all breathed a sigh of relief and said, thank God we're out, now we can actually tell you what happened. So they were basically admitting to everyone else, when we're over here in Israel, and especially in the Palestinian-controlled territories, we can't really tell you the truth. They basically admitted that to everyone. So we exist to first of all counter that, because we're Israelis, Hamas and everyone else wants to kill us anyway, so we might as well just tell the truth. And in the areas that we can't get into, because we're Israelis, we have Arab friends on the ground who will feed us the information that we need. The second reason that we exist, both in Germany and in English, is to give a believer's perspective on what's going on in the land. Now, Rabbi Doug made the comment about objective reporting. There's no such thing as objective news. Human beings are subjective. So all news is going to be subjective, either the way that we say things or the things that we choose to cover. So our faith as Messianic Israelis does influence what we report on and how we report it. And that was missing. There's lots of other coverage from everyone else's perspective, so a believer's perspective was missing in a lot of ways. There are plenty of believers over there saying what's going on, but kind of from the perspective of foreigners who are sitting there in the land. Our office are, besides myself, all native-born Israelis, so we're reporting from the Israeli perspective. So regarding the magazine itself, there are copies out there of our previous issue, if you want to get a taste of it. A lot of you had the flyers in your bulletins. If you fill those out, if you want to subscribe, you can fill those out and return them to me or lay them on the table out there, and our subscription department will get in contact with you and give you a discount based on those cards. So I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel just in general, and also kind of the local Messianic community's perspective on those things. First, I kind of want to talk about a heavier spiritual matter, and then we'll get to like the minor issues like Iran's nuclear bomb. But all joking aside, the spiritual matter is actually more important. So, the issue is deteriorating Christian support for Israel, especially from America. And now I know, standing here, I'm speaking to a Messianic congregation, and in general, this problem doesn't affect the Messianic congregations. However, it's still important to talk about, and it's still important to be informed on what is going on, and it's important to be informed on how Israelis are viewing it, because the Messianics have a role to play in drawing back as much of the church as possible from the brink of this replacement theology that's overtaking it. So when I first moved to Israel almost 2 decades ago, and over the 2 decades that I've been there, I've watched Israelis become increasingly aware of this massive body of Christian support abroad. It got to the point about 10 years ago where average Israeli friends that I would speak to were coming to the realization that even if the guy in the White House doesn't like us so much and is unfriendly to us, we know that there's a bunch of Christians over there that will ultimately serve as a buffer, that he won't be able to hurt us too bad. So it's with a lot of confusion that over the past 3 or 4 years, Israelis are watching as Christians and churches and different denominations are turning their backs to Israel and turning against Israel and becoming hostile. And they're wondering, these guys used to support us, what is going on? And it's not just here and there Israelis that I talk to. This is actually going on in the newspapers. The major Israeli newspapers will almost every week have an op-ed or some article about how this church turned against us, and then some guy will comment on it, and, they write an op-ed about it. And they're all wondering, why, what did we do differently than what was going on 10 years ago? And they suddenly don't like us. And the thing is, and as believers, we can kind of see an angle of it that the average Israeli doesn't see. And we notice that this is especially true amongst younger Christians, amongst the so-called millennials. And the thing is that that generation, my age and younger, and in their 20s, have a tendency to be much less rooted in the Tanakh and in the Word of God than their fathers were. And rather than being rooted in the Word of God, they're steeped in a liberal culture. And that culture has opened the door for them to latch onto the Palestinian cause by way of what is known over there and probably here as well as Palestinian liberation theology, which is a more modern form of replacement theology. And in more recent years, they've kind of toned it down to make it more palatable to a foreign audience, but that's what it is underneath. And the thing is, for someone who's not rooted in the Tanakh, for someone who's not rooted in the Word of God and in the Torah and in the prophets, it is a really appealing message, this Palestinian liberation theology, because it chiefly purports to be concerned with human rights, social justice, kindness, and love in general. And who doesn't want to support these things? It bolsters this argument by pointing to Yeshua's own teachings on these principles. And what young Christian doesn't want to be like Yeshua by being a champion of these principles? And the real kicker for them, for this theology in particular, is that it's coming out of the very land where Yeshua walked. And that's that's what really gets, and it's very appealing. And the thing is that it's not necessarily wrong. I mean, there's obviously a kernel of truth there. Yeshua did call for love and kindness in the way that we treat one another, and even in the way that we treat our enemies. So there's some truth there, but the thing is, to make the leap from that to then pointing an accusing finger at Israel alone, as though it is the only violator of these principles in the world, and to therefore conclude that the modern state of Israel has no connection to the Bible, it couldn't possibly be the reborn state that the prophets spoke of, it's just unbiblical and it's wrong. Now, it is important to stress that Israel's not perfect. No nation is perfect, and Israel's not perfect either. But when we're talking about the rebirth and the redemption of Israel and God's plan in all of this, as believers, it's not the point whether or not Israel is perfect. God always dealt with and through Israel in its imperfection. Had he waited for a perfect Israel, nothing would have ever happened. Yeshua would have never come. And it's the same today. So adopting this line of argument, this theology, is for true Bible believers extremely problematic for two primary reasons. The first is that to demand perfection of the Jew while recognizing that no one else can or does meet that standard is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. The second reason, which is, I believe, much more important and close to my heart, is that the rebirth of Israel as a nation state in our time is something amazing. I mean, people from millennia past would have given anything to live and watch this unfold. We read Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, and we're actually watching some of the major prophecies happen in front of us. And it's an incredible thing. And more than that, it's an incredible witnessing tool. What more tangible evidence is there in the world today that God is real and that he's faithful than the fact that Israel was reborn? I mean, it should be impossible. It's unprecedented for sure, that a nation would go into exile for millennia and then be reborn, just as the prophets themselves said. So to throw away something that is such a strong and tangible witnessing tool is really baffling to me. But there is a spirit of anti-Semitism behind it. And so those pushing from where we're sitting, those pushing this theology, our Arab Christian brothers, those pushing it, the muted versions of Palestinian liberation theology, they do have one valid point, and this is where they're catching everyone. Their one valid point is that Western Christians in particular who support Israel have a tendency to either ignore or be unaware of the fact that there is an Arab church there. There are Arab Christians there, and they're stuck in the middle of the conflict. They're scared of the Muslims. The Jews don't even necessarily know that they're there because they're so small, and they're stuck in the middle. They are in the most unenviable position possible. They really are. And they do deserve our attention and our love and our support. The thing is, though, that love and attention and support has to be based on truth, especially when it's coming from fellow believers. And Palestinian liberation theology and replacement theology does not represent biblical truth. It represents a modern, politically correct, and humanist reimagining of the Brit Hadashah. And it represents a post-biblical interpretation of Yeshua's own teachings. And as an example of this, an example of kind of where this is coming from, a lot of you might be familiar with the Christ at the Checkpoint conference, which is kind of the epicenter of Palestinian liberation theology today. And my magazine has been sending me there every time they hold it every 2 years. And a couple of years ago, I was at the conference, and an American professor of theology from some university out east, he was one of the keynote speakers. And he got up there, and this is to give you an example of where these people are coming from. He got up there and proceeded for the next 30 minutes to mock the Jews for having the audacity to cling to a 4,000-year-old promise as though it was somehow still valid today. And this is a preacher of theology, a preacher of the word. So this gives you kind of an idea of the post-biblical nature of this movement. It is what some people have called, and I think that's right, it is New Testament Christianity, and it cuts off all the rest. It cuts off all the context that should be there. And so this is a big problem that Israelis are becoming aware of. They're starting to become aware of the fact, we've tried to get our buddies in some of the Israeli newspapers, say, you're wondering why all those Christians are turning against you. You need to go cover this thing and listen to what they're saying, because that's why. This is infiltrating the church over there. So they're taking notice. Now, the good thing is that this is not universal amongst the Arab believers. I've recently become friends with a young Arab Christian, originally from Gaza. He's attending Bethlehem Bible College, which hosts the conference I was speaking about. He's frustrated by the Palestinian liberation theology, but he tells me, I've got a mission at this college, and I'm going to stay there, and I'm going to talk to people. He comes from a traditional Orthodox family in Gaza, had a born-again experience, and really came to faith. And through that, began to realize that he's supposed to love his enemy. Had a difficult time doing that because as a Palestinian, he was always taught that the Jews hate us and we're supposed to hate them. But after getting caught trying to cross into cities he wasn't supposed to go in a couple of times and sitting with the Israeli soldiers interrogating him, he really prayed, God help me love these guys. And the Lord really turned his heart around, and suddenly on the spot he had a genuine love for them, and it touched the soldiers and it touched him. So there are people on that side that are coming to a knowledge of this truth. A lot of you are probably aware of traditional Christians, Orthodox Christians up in Nazareth, who are beginning to join the army in large numbers. There's been a 150% increase in the number of Arab Christians joining the IDF over the past year. And there's a whole movement. They've got a whole forum, and they go to schools and they encourage the young Arabs to join. Now, this movement started out kind of as a self-preservation thing. Some of these priests and leaders of this movement were looking around the region and saying, look at this. This is the only place we're actually safe. Let's fight for this place and make sure it doesn't fall too. But over the course of this, a lot of these leaders, and especially a lot of the Arab youth, the Christian youth who are joining the army, have slowly begun to come to a realization that, yes, Israel's great as a democracy and a country that actually protects us and doesn't hurt us, but there's something more. We actually have a connection to these Jews. Jesus was a Jew, so, maybe these guys are actually our brothers. So they've come to this realization, and a lot of them today are not even calling themselves Arabs anymore, they're calling themselves Aramaeans, because they said, the original church that was here was Aramaean, and they were much closer to the Jews, so, and anyway, the Israelis use a lot of Aramaic and Hebrew with the Hebrew language, so there's been a connection that has been made there, and it's kind of like the Jew and the Gentile becoming one. We see it in a different way from over here. Jews, Gentiles coming together with Jews to worship, but over there it's kind of in a real practical matter. Gentiles coming together with Jews to defend the nation of Israel and realizing that there's a brotherhood there. I even see it amongst Muslims. I went up to Nazareth to interview a Muslim woman whose son has been extremely vocal on YouTube in support of Israel. And so I went up to talk to her, how did your son grow up like this? Why would a young Muslim man speak this way? And she told me, the apple hasn't fallen far from the tree. This is how I raised him. And she said, underneath, if anyone bothered to look underneath the surface, which the mainstream media never does, most Arabs in the region have no problem with Israel. They recognize that Israel has actually kept them safer than any of the nations around them would have done, and certainly than the Palestinian Authority would have done. And so there's not a problem there. And the ones that do speak out against Israel and say some hostile things, she said, even those guys, if I actually go and sit with them and speak to them in Arabic and say, what is really your problem? If you have such a problem with Israel, go live in Jenin, go live in Ramallah. And they'll all throw up in their hands and say, no, I'm okay right here. So that kind of gives you the picture. And the thing is, for us as believers watching all of this, there's a recognition that there are a lot of Arabs sitting here in the land. And if they would just get out of the way and stop trying to oppose the redemption of Israel, they would get caught up in it. It will bless them as well. And slowly but surely, some of them are starting to realize that, like this young Gaza Arab and now sitting in Bethlehem, and these Arabs up in Nazareth. So that's something to pray about for sure. So now to move on to kind of current events, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the major current events. You probably all are fairly aware of all of it. Give you a little bit of the Messianic perspective, and then we'll open it up for some questions, because I know sometimes I'm viewing things from a different angle than someone over here would be. The first one is the BDS movement, which kind of ties into the replacement theology that I was talking about. BDS has really caught Israel's attention over the past year. Obviously, it's been going on longer than that, but several Israeli writers have started to publish articles, kind of frantic articles, like, is this BDS thing a problem? Like, does it actually pose an existential threat to Israel? And fortunately, there have been some reports, several of them from the U.S. itself, showing the numbers. BDS last year hit Israel to the tune of about $10 billion. It's a lot of money, but compared to Israel's overall economy, it's not a too big of a hit. But at the same time, it hit the Palestinians for $5 billion, and compared to their GDP, that was a major blow. And so here, we often go and speak to average Palestinians. What do you think about this BDS? And the vast majority of them all will tell you, we don't understand why these fools abroad think that they're helping us by going out and boycotting Israel. All they're doing is causing us to lose our jobs. So they're all totally frustrated with it. It hurts them far more than it hurts Israel. And the thing is, though, that the leaders of the BDS movement, they don't care. Because in truth, they are an economic Hamas. They don't care if they hurt their own people as long as they achieve their goal of destroying Israel. So, and the average Palestinians feel this, and they're not supportive of it at all, just as most of them are not supportive of Hamas. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit. Why would they vote for Hamas? But we'll talk about that. We recently had an election, as you all know. On the surface, it would appear to have just been another one of our elections that we sadly have every 2 years instead of 4 as we're supposed to. And we'll probably have another one in another 2 years. But underneath, there was a very fateful element to this past election. Because over the past year or two, there has been a fierce struggle within the Knesset and within the nation itself over the Jewish identity of Israel. Do we continue to cling to the Jewish identity of the state of Israel and in fact bolster that identity, or do we move more towards just being one of the nations, a nation among nations? And there's a large percentage of Israelis that feel that way. They just want to be left alone. They just want to be a nation among nations. And of course, they were warned against doing that in the Word of God. But a lot of them are tired. And the feeling was, because the way that the media over there portrayed it, was that a majority of Israelis felt this way. So when the Knesset, when the cabinet forwarded a couple of bills that were going to solidify, or more solidify, the notion of Israel as the Jewish state, they were fiercely debated and partially rejected, but they never came to a vote because of the election itself. But there was a feeling that side, the side that wants to identify as a Jewish state and cling to that, was going to lose the election. So when Netanyahu and the conservatives and the right wing came out so overwhelmingly on top, as a whole, I mean, it really shocked a lot of people, including the Israeli media, that, okay, well, I guess most of us do still want to be a Jewish state and cling to that. So in that sense, it was a very fateful election because it kind of sets the tone for the coming years as well. Whether or not the current Netanyahu government survives more than a couple of years, I don't know, and I kind of doubt it. But that issue was kind of, we kind of reached a conclusion on that issue itself, at least for the time being. And the thing is that I think it will continue to move in that way. And the reason is that following the previous election, a couple of really interesting things happened. Netanyahu reinstated the Prime Minister's Office Bible study, and the whole nation took notice. The Knesset, in the Knesset itself, one of the so-called secular parties, Yesh Atid, they started a Knesset Bible study, a weekly study in this, quote-unquote secular party, not the religious themselves. And it was very well attended up until this last election. I don't know how it's going now, but a lot of Knesset members were attending it every week. And they were discussing the Bible as part of their politics, as part of the politics of Israel. And about 4 or 5 months ago, the government, the Prime Minister's Office and the Knesset together, they launched a website and an initiative called the National Bible Study. And it's supposed to take 3.5 years. And there's a website that Israelis can visit every day. And every day it presents them with a chapter from the Bible, with commentary from rabbis, commentary from public figures, and they're trying to get the entire nation, and this is the government of Israel, is trying to get the entire nation to read the Bible every day. So I mean, I don't want to paint the picture that Israel is going to tomorrow turn around and be a totally pure and biblical nation. It's not the case. There's still a lot of problems there. There's a serious spiritual struggle going on, a serious spiritual struggle. But there is a movement, slow and steady, in the right direction. Now, your elections, your upcoming. Okay, so I kind of can judge by the response where I can go with this. Israelis are really happy that you're about to have an election, because they know that the current guy can't be in again, so it'll at least be someone else. Now, again, when I first got there almost 20 years ago, I was really surprised on my first few Israeli Independence Days. Israelis put these little plastic Israeli flags on their car windows on Independence Day and drive around for a few days like that. Now, the first few years I was there, everyone, and I mean everyone, was putting an Israeli flag and an American flag on their car and driving around like the American flags all over the streets, because everyone viewed America's support as central to Israel's existence, and they appreciated that support. Today, not a single American flag will be found on Israeli independence, not a single one. And in fact, the guys out there selling the flags on the street corners don't even bother to bring out the American ones anymore. It's just the Israeli flag. So the attitude is shifting. And it's not that Israelis today don't like America. Like I said, a lot of them are beginning to realize that Americans love Israel even if the government doesn't. So they're really frustrated with the White House. And the fact that Netanyahu has been in office so long and he understands the American political system has helped a lot of Israelis to kind of understand it better as well. The White House might not like us, but the Congress does. But there's been a real shift in attitude in the way that Israelis view America, and there's been a real shift in the way that the Arab nations around us view America, and all of us, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt. No one believes any longer that, okay, when things get really bad, America will have our back. Israelis don't believe it any longer, and that's a real problem, especially when it comes to Iran, which we'll speak about in a minute. So Israelis are happy that you're going to have an election. They don't really know who the candidates are, until the election process here gets going, besides Hillary Clinton. And they loved Bill, so a lot of them are rooting for Hillary. But look, for all of the mistakes that he made in the peace process and the terrible debacle that it was, Bill Clinton was a very charming figure, and he caught Israelis with that charm. So for better or worse, that's how they view him. And they're kind of hoping that his wife is the same. They might find out differently if she actually gets in the White House, but so, we try to talk to them a little bit about this, but But it'll start to change as the campaigning really gets going, and some of the Republican candidates and more of the Democrats kind of put out their positions on Israel. And that's another amazing thing that Israelis are starting to take notice of, is that how amazing is it that this tiny little nation that everybody says, it doesn't matter that much, it's just this little backwater country that's causing all these problems in this place where we're trying to get our oil. How amazing that this tiny little country plays so centrally in the election campaigning of the world's most powerful countries. It's for years already been a major issue in American presidential elections and congressional elections. Last year or 2 years ago, it was a central plank in the platform of those running for office in Canada, and it has started to become so in Europe as well, Germany, France, the UK. So it's amazing to watch that as a believer, because we know that God has made Israel the focal point of his plan for the world. Everyone else tries to deny that, but deny it as much as they try, they're forced to recognize it. And that's why they all campaign on Israel. Why else would they campaign on Israel? So to move on to Iran, because it kind of fits with what I said with the way Israelis are viewing America lately. The reason Israel is so worried about Iran is because, like I said, nobody trusts that America is actually going to do anything, at least not under the current administration, if Iran, comes after us or gives a nuclear weapon to someone else. And it's not only us, the Saudis feel that way. They've said, the moment they have a bomb, we're building ours too, because they don't trust that America will be a deterrent. So whether or not Israel's going to bomb Iran, I can't tell you. There is frantic debates, I would say, in Israel at the moment over what to do, because everyone recognizes that we have to do something. To start a war with Iran, it doesn't sound like a very good deal. But to just sit around and trust that, if Iran tries to give a bomb to Hezbollah, that we can intercept it in time, that's really risky. So I don't know what will happen there, but Israel is increasingly looking to itself rather than to America. And about a year ago, we commissioned a poll in Israel amongst average Israelis, not amongst believers, not amongst Orthodox, but amongst average Israelis, the quote-unquote seculars, and Arabs as well, asking them, with all of the threats facing us, especially Iran, who do you look for to protect the nation of Israel? And we gave them three choices: the IDF, America, or God. A lot of people said the IDF. They always do. And people could choose more than one answer, but a lot of people said the IDF. Very few said America. And an overwhelming majority said God, which also kind of plays into what I was talking about before, that there is a slow and steady movement back towards the Word of God. It's slow and steady. I mean, you won't see Israelis raising their hand and worshiping God, as a nation yet, but it is slow and steady, and they're starting to recognize that they need to go back to that source. So where's the Messianic community at in all of this? How do they view everything? With the election itself, now this may be interesting to a lot of believers over on this side of the pond, is that at least half of Israeli Messianics, and probably more like 60%, don't support Netanyahu. Okay? We ran a story a couple of months ago, asked a bunch of Messianic leaders and lay people what they thought of Netanyahu's re-election. They weren't happy. The reason for that is, and what is important to remember when we're looking at and supporting Israel, is that Israel is not just the conflict and the peace process. Israel is also a normal, living, breathing nation with all of the normal issues and problems to deal with that every other nation has: economic issues, social issues, etc. And a lot of Israelis, while most Israelis would side with Netanyahu when it comes to the issue of the land and the peace process in Iran, and a lot of Israelis, in fact most, even leftists, saw him come before Congress. And even if they weren't happy that he went to Congress in defiance of Obama, they watched the speech and they said, wow, none of us can present our case like that guy can. So there's a recognition of that, but when it comes to social issues and economic issues, a lot of them don't like him, because you need to remember that Israel is a very socialist nation. And Netanyahu is a very Reagan-esque capitalist. So that's primarily why a lot of them, they view him as kind of out of touch with the average Israeli when it comes to financial economic issues. Now the thing is, his policies are really smart in finances and economics. And when he has had the opportunity to actually implement his policies, everyone looks at him and says, wow, that actually worked. But until it gets to that point, everyone's screaming about how this capitalist pig is ruining our nation. So that's the primary. And a lot of the Messianic body, at least the native-borns, they're Israelis. And like I said, Israel is a very socialist nation, so it's hard for them to swallow sometimes a capitalist leader. So that's the reason that you'll get a lot of opposition to Netanyahu amongst Messianics. Regarding Iran, most Messianics, like I said, would side with Netanyahu. We're in grave danger. Obviously, something's going to happen, and God's going to protect us. But we need to look to God and to ourselves, not to foreign powers. Israelis serve in the army openly, as most of you. Messianics serve in the Israeli army, as most of you know, proudly. The openness of believers, and I saw you have Moran here next week. He's a good friend of mine, so he'll probably speak about the Messianic community a lot more than I will. And he'll give you a better perspective, having been born there and raised there. But just since I've been there in the 20 years, 20 years ago, and certainly 30 years ago, and 40 years ago, believers were, they kind of kept quiet about their faith. Weren't necessarily afraid, like you might be in a place like the former Soviet Union, but they weren't open about it, kept it themselves. And it could be detrimental to your job prospects, and certainly you wouldn't be open about it in the army. But just since I've been there personally, I've seen that change in a pretty big way. Just to give you some personal examples, to prove that I'm not just pulling this out of the air. My wife works at the hospital as a midwife. She's a believer, an Israeli believer. And everyone there knows she's a believer. All of her fellow midwives know she's a believer. There are religious people in her department. No problem. They don't have a problem with it at all. But more than that, knowing that she's a believer, when certain things come up and they see the way that she handles a situation or treats people, or when they see the way that we live, especially the fact that we have a lot of children, but we're obviously not Orthodox, they get curious. And knowing that she's a believer, they'll sit her down and say, okay, we know that you believe this, so tell us about it. Why would that cause you to be this way, or to do that, or to do this? And she has a lot of opportunity regularly to share with them about why she believes this, what it means to her, and what it means to Israel. And it's not isolated. That's a growing trend. Messianics today are commonly open about their faith in their places of work. It doesn't mean they walk in the door and start preaching every morning, but everyone knows they're a believer, and when they live out their faith, Israelis get curious and ask. And in fact, it's even true in the army. I had a friend about 5-6 years ago. He was in the army, and as part of their team-building exercises, they had to do a presentation about something that was important to them in their lives. So he decided, you know what, he was terrified to do it, but I'm going to share about my faith. So he got up there and gave his platoon a presentation about Yeshua. And he said he was shocked that at the end, everyone loved it. And in fact, the most religious soldier in his platoon came to him afterwards to talk about it, and they became fast friends after that, because the guy realized that, okay, I disagree with you about the identity of the Messiah, but we obviously have a lot in common. We're waiting for the same thing. We're waiting for the same redemption. We believe the same things. We live the same way. So this is, and like I said, this is a growing trend. Today, Messianics go into the army and are not shy about their faith. Like I said, they're not necessarily preaching, at every opportunity, but they're open about the fact that they're believers. There was an Air Force cadet that was, finished his training, and they do the ceremony at the Western Wall. Messianic, openly Messianic, and in fact, when they did the ceremony there, he asked his commanding officer, can I also have the Brit Chadashah to put my hand on a pledge? Commander had no problem, brought over a New Testament, let him do it. Some months back, there was a young Messianic soldier going through the officers' training course down in the Negev, and there was an ultra-Orthodox cadet in the group as well. And for whatever reason, I forget the reason, but the ultra-Orthodox cadet came to the point, he said, I cannot go through the course with this guy. This guy believes in Jesus, he's a missionary, I'm not going to stay in the course. The commanding officer of the base, the commanding officer of the officers' training course, this is a major general in the IDF, he made a ruling, and he published it openly in the newspapers. He said, this guy is our brother, he's a Jew, he's an Israeli, you have to serve with him. It doesn't matter if you disagree with him about who Yeshua is or his faith or whatnot, he's an Israeli. So, Now, again, I don't want to give the impression that, every Israeli is about to become Messianic. Every Israeli is about to accept Yeshua. It's not the case. And there is still, what some people would call persecution of Messianics, but it's kind of the same hostility that any different Jewish sect might face from those who disagree with them within the nation. So it happens, but by and large, when it does happen and when it reaches the national media or whatnot, the average Israeli will kind of throw up their hands like, just leave these Messianics alone. They didn't do anything. So that's where the trend is going, that there's a lot more acceptance of Messianics as an integral part of Israel and as Jews. Whereas in the past, a lot of Israelis would say, you accepted Jesus, you're not a Jew anymore. You might be Israeli, but you're not a Jew. That's changing as well. So slowly but surely, it is changing. And that's going to open a lot of doors, obviously. And even our coverage as a magazine, as an openly Messianic magazine, is evidence of this. We have no problem going to anyone in the governments, even a lot of people in the Orthodox community. They know we're believers. They don't have a problem. They still speak to us. Even if they do have a problem, they still speak to us. A few years ago, and this was just a year before I got to the magazine, Yitzhak Kaduri died, and he left this note, the Messiah note. And we covered it, got it from some friends in the Israeli media, and we covered the story. And my boss went to Kaduri's son, who himself is an elderly rabbi today, a respected rabbi. And he went to visit with the guy and talked to him about his father's note. And, he was all distressed because he said, oh, no, now, you mean all the Christians are going to think that my dad said that Yeshua is the Messiah? So he said, well, that's what everyone's talking about. So he asked him if he could see some of his father's work, the books that he had been studying in his final years. And my boss told me, he was going through these books with his son, and Kaduri would write notes all over the margins of his books, filled with notes. But along a bunch of the margins in certain areas where there were scriptures, he would put a cross. And so my boss asked his son, what is the symbol that your dad kept putting on in all these places? He said, I don't know. I asked him once, and he told me it was the symbol of the angel. And so my boss said, are you not connecting the dots here a little bit? So if there's any doubt that Kaduri was talking about Yeshua in his notes, there you go. So, we don't have a problem speaking to anyone as Messianics. Even people who might not want to speak to us, there are fringe elements today. They make a lot of noise, Yad Lachim, some of these other groups, they make a lot of noise, but they are fringe elements. And the average Israeli is warming up, slowly but surely, to the Messianic. And parallel to that, Israeli society as a whole, and this goes for the Orthodox and the quote-unquote secular, are starting to reclaim Yeshua. We read all the time articles in newspapers and in Orthodox news websites saying, this guy is one of ours. He came from us. Those of us who have read what he had to say, it's okay stuff. In fact, there was a very popular Israeli singer, Ehud Banai, about a year ago. He wrote a big article in Yediot Ahronot, the biggest newspaper, and it was in their big Shabbat edition. And he opened the article by stating, I love Yeshua. He's not a believer, but he said, I don't believe he's the Messiah, but I love Yeshua. I've gone and read everything that he said, and it's good stuff. We should all read it. Like he said, he's one of our rabbis. We read lots of rabbis, some of whom also claim to be the Messiah. They also wrote some good stuff. We read those. Why not read what Yeshua had to say too? So this is also a growing movement, that Israeli Jews, even religious, are reclaiming Yeshua as one of their own. Even if they don't necessarily believe he's the Messiah, they're reclaiming him. So that's just to kind of give you a picture where Israel is right now, where it's going. Like I said, I don't want to paint the wrong picture that Israel is about to become a believing nation overnight, but it is moving in the right direction. There is, and obviously, all of us who have read the word and know what's happening know that this is a process, and this is a part of that process. They were going to be restored to the land in their unbelief. They were going to have those important parts of the lands restored to them. They were going to have Jerusalem restored to them. They're going to have the Temple Mount restored to them, and then their hearts are going to be changed as well. So we see the groundwork being laid for the changing of hearts. So with that, I'll go ahead and open up to any questions anyone might have.
want to catch the questions, okay? Here you go.
You mentioned the BDS movement, the Boycott Israel.
Right.
Some companies in Europe are observing. Is there any boycott the boycotters type of movement?
Yes. Oh, yeah. And there are individual movements, all around the world in Europe and the U.S., where different groups are coming together and saying, okay, you're going to boycott Israel, so we're going to buy more Israeli products. And Israel itself is pushing it. The government is pushing it. They've started to train young Israelis that they know are going to go study abroad. They've opened a program for them that they can come to the foreign ministry, and I think the Jewish Agency is involved as well, and they can go through a training course that when you go to these universities abroad and you're confronted with this phenomenon, this is how you should respond. This is the way to engage it. And in fact, they're even teaching them how to speak to the Christians as well, because they know that a lot of Christians are involved.
Well, hang on.
How about an individual company that chooses to boycott Israel? Are there people that boycott that company's products?
There may be, but I'm not aware of it from the Israeli side, no.
Thank you. Question back here.
Thank you, Ryan, for your great presentation. What is your estimate of the number of confessing, observant Messianic believers currently in Israel today?
The number most commonly thrown around is 15,000. And I think it might be a little bit inflated, but not by much. And there's about, I think, 120, 150 congregations today. So.
Didn't Netanyahu also have a lot of good things to say about Messianics in his speaking, and other major leaders have said they were like one of the major help of the state?
With Netanyahu, you mean Netanyahu's view of Messianics?
Yeah.
Netanyahu is viewed by the Messianic community as fairly friendly towards them. Because I'll kind of give you an example of why. Every election, and it happened this election too, and we wrote about it because it was a little bit more dangerous this time, but every election, Netanyahu has to cobble together a coalition, and it's a difficult task. So every time he invites in one of these parties, they have their demands of what they want from him if they're going to join his government. And every time, for the past decade, that Shas and the UTJ, United Torah Judaism, come in to present their demands, one of their demands is always a bill that would curb what they call missionary activity in the country. And the way that they've worded it would also have a major detrimental impact on the Messianic body. Netanyahu's office always rejects it.
Ryan, this is a soothing balm to the soul, I think, for all of us that are here. I think you've got a captive audience. We appreciate you being here. Some of the research that I've done recently, I just dug up a list, and this is available online if you choose to find a list of the companies and or products that the BDS movement is attempting to vilify in the media. Immediately you can take that list and reverse it. So when you see a product like hummus manufactured by a company called Sabra, clearly an Israeli company, recommendation would be to go to your grocer, Trader Joe's or Vons or wherever you do your shopping. Not only do you buy the product, but you go to the manager and say, do you have any other Israeli products I can buy? And maybe bring a list of things that the grocer could stock. And one of the best ways that I've ever learned to make a protest is at the pocketbook. And so every one of us here has an opportunity to make that statement quietly when you go to your store and buy what you got to buy.
Another interesting thing to do would be some people that we're connected to and some other journalists as well over the years have gone into Gaza City, Bethlehem, Ramallah, and they'll go to the grocery stores there and take pictures of all the Israeli products on the shelves. And then you can go to your grocery store here that refuses to stock Israeli product and say, well, look, the Palestinians carry it.
I have a question regarding anti-Zionism, which is basically anti-Semitism. Do you think it's more effective for Americans to be fighting anti-Zionism, because I debate with a lot of Muslims? Would it be more effective to debate the Christian anti-Zionists? What would make the biggest impact for Israel?
It's very problematic to fight anti-Semitism today, just because everyone will make this strong argument about, hey, I'm not anti-Semitic because I don't hate the Jews. I don't want them to die. And I'm talking about the Christians who are behind the replacement theology. And even at this conference that I would go to, they all stressed from the podium, we are not anti-Semitic. We don't wish ill upon the Jews, but this land isn't theirs anymore. So it's difficult to attack them on that point because the rest of the world will then look at you and say, look, they're not anti-Semitic. They're not trying to kill the Jews. They're not the Nazis. But it is obviously so it's better today to try to bring everyone to an understanding that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And the Israeli government is trying to do that. That's a lot of what they're teaching these students that will go abroad, is how to equate the two and show everybody how Zionism is not, it's not first and foremost a political movement. It is the hope of the Jewish people from thousands of years to return to their land, a biblical hope. Or, it's part of their faith. It's not politics. So to deny that and to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-everything that the Jewish people have hoped for 2,000 years, which is anti-Semitism.
We call that killing them softly.
Exactly.
That's it. Steve. Hang on, Steve. Don't go anywhere. Oh, well, hang on. Marcy's been married.
A lot of discussion has been brought up about Mr. Netanyahu being Messianic and believing in Yeshua. Do you have any comments on that, and what is really going on? And the second question is, how many parties are in the Knesset?
Regarding Netanyahu.
It's one big party.
Yeah, everybody asks about Netanyahu. I don't know. I do know that he's not antagonistic towards the Messianics, and when he has come in personal contact with him, he has not been antagonistic. Like I said, he restarted the Prime Minister's Office Bible study. I do believe that the guy reads his Bible. I do even believe that he has at least perused the New Testament. I would not at all be surprised. I don't necessarily think he's a believer, but I think he is one of those Israelis who has reclaimed Yeshua as a part of Israel and is willing to read what Yeshua said, and that's a first step.
That's a huge step. I think it's a huge step.
Oh, sorry. In the recent election, I'm trying to remember, I think there are currently 7 parties in the Knesset.
7?
I don't remember because all the Arab parties came together as one this year, and I don't remember how that affected the number.
So just a quick question. I was over in Israel a couple of years ago, and I was there for 3.5 weeks. And I have a lot of Israeli friends that live here in the States. In Israel, I mean, I'm definitely a supporter of Israel, but I also had a problem when I was there because I went to the other side of the wall, and I saw the disparity. Mm-hmm. And then actually one of my friends who is from France, who happened to be Asian, coming back to the Israeli side of the wall was kind of difficult for him. Whereas here in the States, Israelis, Arabs, I mean Palestinians, everyone seems to get along for the most part here. But then there's my friends, and they're probably younger and stuff. But over there it was kind of, and me being black, it's also, it seems kind of like separate but equal, the wall. It was kind of.
This is a very important topic to get on. First of all, I mean, you're using the wall as an example of this, and it's a good example. Like I said, I went to this Christ at the checkpoint the past few years, and I had to go through the wall to get there, and I hate that wall. It's a terrible structure. Nobody wanted it there. But the first thing is that despite the way that it's presented, the wall has not always been there, and it wasn't thrown up arbitrarily. When I first moved there, well, actually, after I'd been there for a few years, the Intifada kicked off. And I lived in the southern part of Jerusalem, and we could stand on our rooftop every night and watch the gunfire coming into southern Jerusalem from that part of Bethlehem. And more than that, our buses were blowing up at least once a week in Jerusalem. And my wife was going to school at the time. I was terrified to send her to school every day, but. So it wasn't put up arbitrarily, it was put up for a reason. And there were 2 choices. Either we build a wall and try to stop this from coming in, or we send the army into their backyards every day. So it wasn't just put up for no reason, and even those Israelis like myself who didn't want the wall to go up can't argue with the fact that terrorism, and especially suicide bombings, are down 99%. I mean, I just can't argue with the fact, and it worked. Now the thing is, the wall is ugly. I can certainly imagine as I go through it, being a Palestinian, having to stand in that line every day to go through to the other side for my job. It would be terrible, and I certainly wouldn't want to live close to it. But a lot of Palestinians that we speak to will also tell you that it's not Israel that's hurting us. It's our own leadership. And to go even further, a lot of them that we speak to today now, and they've come to this realization over 20 years, will tell you who was the genius in the West that thought it was a good idea to bring the PLO and Yasser Arafat in as the negotiating partner with Israel? Why? Yasser Arafat wasn't from the land. The PLO wasn't native to the land. They started out in Egypt, they moved to Jordan, they moved to Lebanon, they had never been in the land. And a lot of these guys on the ground, you go talk to the average Palestinian, we'll go talk to a construction worker or something who works with Jews, who still works with Jews, and he'll tell you, we got along fine until everyone had their bright ideas about how to solve the problem. Jews and Arabs on the ground were getting along okay, and when there was a problem, the leaderships from both communities would come together and talk. So it was the wisdom of men from the Western nations trying to solve a problem that God said couldn't be solved that has only exacerbated the suffering for the Palestinians, in fact.
Brian, if I may interject a thought, so many people these days don't know history. Yeah. And because they don't know history, they're at a loss to understand the current situations. And people who study history all of a sudden, oh my goodness, now I see how we got to where it is. Anybody who has a garage, if you look at your garage and see where things are and aren't and how everything's stacked and the paint cans on top of the lawnmower and all these things, right? And if you don't know the history, you don't know how it got there. But when you know the history, you'd watch it and say, oh yeah, now I see it. And I think that's a great example there, and I wish more people were aware of history and this kind of thing. It's a perfect example. Okay, Stephen, you've been patient. There you go. Are you done yet?
I'm curious about how strong Yad La'achim is. Are they still embedded in the government? They're anti-missionary, and is the aliyah for Messianic Jews impossible or case by case? Do you have to hide, like under radar, that you're a Messianic Jew?
Yad La'achim still, unfortunately, has a lot of influence in the Interior Ministry. Israel's Channel 2, the big TV station, did an expose on it some years ago. They sent a guy in with a hidden camera into the Interior Ministry to deal with different issues. I think he was even posing as a Christian or something else. But his camera caught, that as they opened their files, the Interior Ministry clerks would open their files, there would be notes inside the binder from Yad La'achim about this person, how the Interior Ministry was supposed to view this person. So yeah, they've still got their tentacles in there. And the problem is, we have bureaucracy in Israel, the same as you have here. The governments may change and the minister may change, but Shas spent 20 years planting its people in the Interior Ministry, and those people are still there. So for Messianic Jews trying to make Aliyah, it's case by case. I mean, I've seen a couple of Messianics go over to make Aliyah and, very boldly write on the application form, I am a believer in Yeshua, and obviously then you're going to have problems. But look, according to the law, you're Jewish, you have a right to come back to Israel. They'll try to put every roadblock they possibly can in front of you, and for a lot of Messianics, they do have to take it to court. But from what I've seen, most of them win.
I have a question. What school do the believers go to? Do they go to the public school?
Yeah, most Messianic children go to the public schools.
Okay.
There is a Messianic school in Jerusalem, but it only goes up through middle school.
All right. Now, they still, I'm an Israeli, they teach at least 3 times a week the Bible, the
Right.
Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because
Yes.
you said the government is trying to bring the
Right.
Bible to
No,
the
they
people.
they teach Bible in the public schools.
But there is Bible in the schools.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what, the fact that he's going to always quote, you said Bibi, right, quoting the Bible, it's irrelevant because they have to memorize the Bible. I memorize 3-4 times a week.
But the
So the
fact-
Bible
right.
really exists. It's really part of the culture.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
but what has struck us, or struck me at least, is that it's more and more people like Netanyahu and people in the government are quoting the Bible as part of their job as public officials. It's actually becoming more of the political discourse is coming from the Bible itself.
Always like that.
Well,
Yeah? Yeah, Ben Gurion, I know him.
We wish we could have our Congress have a Bible study, you know. All right, now.
Do they
since,
not? There's a lot of Christians there.
Yeah. They can't even have a, you know,
I guess they can't pray publicly.
somebody
huh?
open up to start the thing. All right.
So I'd like to thank you also. Fascinating discussion today. Curious how you learned Hebrew. Did you know Hebrew going over there? Did you learn when you were there? How much do you speak it today?
Just over the course of being there. I took classes at first, but got too busy to continue with it. So
Are you fluent now in Hebrew?
I wouldn't say that I'm completely fluent. I mean, I've worked in tourism and then in media in English, so my work has always been in English. So
Thank you.
Immersion. You want to learn Hebrew? Start right here with this young lady.
Thank you for coming. Oh, thank you. I had heard some news, and I don't know if it's true, but there was a large Messianic conference in Jerusalem not long ago, mostly charismatics.
Yeah.
People from all over the world
Right.
came. And afterwards, now they are issuing permits. You have to get a permit because there were too many attempts at conversion according to the religious orthodoxy.
in fact, there were none, but okay.
Okay, so that was, I just didn't know if that just was something that was sent to me, and it tends to help donations because we're worried that there's limited ability to reach people because speech is being shut down in terms of talking to Israelis about Yeshua. And then the second thing kind of competing with it is that I know that we're now, I guess, in Ramadan, and ISIS is making quite a strong movement into Israel and has basically threatened particularly Christians in Israel that there's going to be before the end of Ramadan some effort to annihilate a large portion of them. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Regarding believers in general and Messianic sharing their faith, yeah, there was this big conference. I think it was a Pentecostal conference. And already Yad Lachim and some of these other groups had tried to get these kind of bans in place because there was a Jehovah's Witness conference a couple months earlier. Surprised to know that they're actually active in Israel. But, and Yad Lachim always claims, that they're converting Jews at this place. In fact, it was a conference for people from abroad to come and, they just wanted to hold it in Jerusalem. It had nothing to do with Israelis necessarily. But from what I understand, like you said, this was right when I was traveling, so I didn't read much into it. From what I understand, they did partially get this ban at least. I don't know how it's going to play out because, first of all, it goes against some of Israel's laws. Second of all, Israelis, including the mayor of Jerusalem, recognize the importance of Christian support. So I can't imagine that the next time a big conference comes along, Christian conference, the mayor is going to tell them, I'm sorry, I can't let you have your conference here. I just don't see that happening. So we'll see how it plays out, but I think the Orthodox are trying to make a lot of noise, and in the end it'll fizzle out. They always try to claim that believers sharing their faith is illegal, that it amounts to missionary activity, when in fact Israeli law has nothing against it whatsoever. The only thing you're not allowed to do is try to convert a minor or offer a monetary incentive to change your faith. Those are the only things that are technically illegal. So, and it's gone to court several times. Messianic lawyers have fought it in the court systems, that what these guys are trying to do to us is illegal. Israeli law protects our rights to share our faith. And even the Israeli public, I'll see it sometimes in the newspapers and on television news. A lot of Israelis will say, how is that any different than the Chabad guy that's standing on the street corner passing out tracts to me? It's no different.
Is it illegal to talk to children about Yeshua?
It would certainly at least be illegal to initiate it.
Okay. Be careful, she's a lawyer.
I don't know because it's never actually come to a case like that.
She's
so
not the only one in here, though. Okay, one more question since I think we're okay. Two more questions. Two more questions because I think people want to get to the oneg before we're falling. Oh, two more questions. Okay.
Oh, the ISIS part. Sorry, I'll answer the ISIS part of her question quickly. Israelis are coming to a greater realization that nobody was necessarily afraid of the main body of ISIS threatening us directly. I mean, everyone's terrified of them because of what they do, but there was no fear that they were actually going to somehow get all the way over to us. But there's a growing realization that ISIS is dangerous as an ideology, and it's starting to crop up. You know, there's suddenly an ISIS group in Sinai attacking Egypt. You know, where did they come from? So there's a fear, and they're popping up in Gaza, and even a little bit in Jerusalem of late. So there's a recognition of this. Israel will crack down on it. Like I said, the Christians in the land are more and more aligning themselves with Israel, recognizing what's going on with their brothers in other countries around. So I have high hopes that the current government, which has been very open to this growing Christian movement within the land, will protect them.
I have a question about the black Jews. Why is the leaders in Israel don't want they want the Africans to leave Israel, and they want the black Jews to leave Israel? If they don't leave Israel, they're going to put them in jail.
Now, there are several different groups we can talk about. There are the black Hebrews that came primarily from the U.S., that lived down in Dimona. For the most part, they keep to themselves. Most Israelis are, in fact, not even aware of them. A lot of the Orthodox have a problem with them because they don't recognize them as truly Jewish. They have a problem with them being in the land and being allowed to stay there. Another group of Africans are the refugees coming over from Sudan, some of the other countries around Eritrea. And they've been flooding into the land, and this is a huge debate in Israel over what to do with these people, because it is an enormous strain on the Israeli economy to have tens of thousands of people coming in. At the same time, a lot of Israelis will turn around and say, yeah, but this is how we were treated in Europe, so we can't turn our back on someone else who's suffering and who is a refugee. So it's a big debate right now what to do, because the money is not there to actually help and absorb these people, but Israel wants to help these people somehow. In the meantime, as we wait to find a solution to this and figure out the debate, a lot of them are kept in camps, army-protected camps, what could actually be called prisons. Because, the fact is they entered the country illegal, and Israel needs to figure out what to do with someone who crossed the border illegally. The other body of people are the Ethiopian Jews, and they are recognized as Jewish. And in fact, just this last year, we finally brought over the last of the Ethiopian Jews. That return is finished. So, and another thing, plays into the whole Bible starting to make its way into the Israeli psyche more, is that the media in Israel has here and there talked about this return of Jews from different places like Ethiopia, and now we're discussing the Ukraine and France, trying to get them to come home. And people will, different media will quote the verse about Jews being gathered from the four corners. This is supposed to happen, so even though it's very difficult for Israel to absorb this many people, they make a way to do it.
Pretty amazing, pretty amazing. Last question here. By the way, Ryan is going to be staying for our own egg, so in between bites, he'll be able to answer your questions if you have them.
Before the voting went on, there was a group lobbying the public and the Arabs to get to the polls. What effect did they have on the voting, and were the people aware that they came out of the United States and were most likely sent by our president to have Netanyahu lose?
That was a really interesting episode within the election, because there was a lot of speculation that, this whole thing to bus all of these people to the polls just after the fact that this supposedly grassroots movement had popped up during the election and this movement didn't care who was elected as long as it wasn't Benjamin Netanyahu. And come to find out, the Israeli media found out that there's a bunch of Americans behind it. And wait a second, a lot of those Americans are actually connected to the Obama administration. So there was a big fuss over this. But then Netanyahu kind of made a mistake with his statement towards just hours before the end of the polls, and saying, oh no, they're busing all these people, quick, everyone go out and vote so the Arabs don't win the vote. It's like, he shouldn't have worded it that way, and it shouldn't have been so frantic. But the fact is that it probably did help him quite a bit. So
we have a few politicians here. We have a few politicians who occasionally word things, as they say, inartfully, and so we're familiar with that.
You know, the foreign ministry has started a new program parallel to teaching young students that are going abroad. They've started a new program to teach Knesset members how to speak in front of the media and how to keep their mouth shut when they're supposed to keep quiet.
Right. In fact, and I emailed you that there's an effort now to train Israelis as they leave Israel for vacations and so on. Did you want to say anything about that?
Well, that has a lot to do with the students, with the people going abroad to
being
study
sent
abroad.
overseas, right,
and
right.
yeah, they've opened up this course for whoever wants to come and learn, because Israelis are more aware of the problems on campus.
Indeed. And I see the little ones are starting to come in. So why don't we close? Let's close with a prayer for Israel. If you would just stand and just join me in prayer. Let's lift up the state of Israel and our Messiah. Avinu, we thank you, Lord, for this time together with Ryan. I thank you, Lord, for his faith and his service to honor you among our Jewish people. And, Lord, not just the Jewish people, but all people who know you. Father, I just want to lift up the state of Israel, the leadership there, all of the political leaders, all of those who have influence on what's going on in Israel. Lord, may your spirit move strongly among them. And Lord, may you bring them back to you. Lord, may they turn towards your word, and in your word, may they come to know Messiah Yeshua, the promised Messiah of Israel, indeed the promised Messiah of the world. And Father, we just thank you for this time together. Look forward to what you're going to do in the future. And we celebrate, Lord, your hand that has gone through the ages and maintained your Jewish people as evidence of your commitment and your keeping your word. May we all take comfort in that. And we give you all the praise and thanksgiving. B'Shem Yeshua Mishikenu, in the name of Yeshua our Messiah. And all God's people said, Amen.